All right, y'all. The white man is the slave of time. The Indian is the master of time. So we're moving everybody towards Indian time, right? And Mike, maybe you want to, at the end of this program, you may want to sing "I Did It My Way" for this group. But anyway. All right, good afternoon and welcome back. As promised before lunch, Sheldon and his team are here, and they're going to help us explore what some of the preventive solutions might be as we think about medical product shortages in disasters. And that would include the chronic disease backdrop that I've underscored more than once of shortages in the peacetime. But I'm going to turn it over to Sheldon, who's the founder, professor of computer sciences at Urbana-Champaign, Urbana, which is out there in the great Midwest. And I'm turning it over to you, Sheldon. Go for it.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you all for being here. The last 30 hours have been tremendous. I think we can all agree to that. And I appreciate you coming back after lunch. So that is a good thing as well. If you think about the number of people who have been here and the number of connections that have been made, roughly the potential is for on the order of around 5,000 new or renewed connections have existed because of this meeting. And as has been pointed out by one of the participants, that in fact has tremendous value. Now, in listening to many of the questions and the discussions, which have absolutely provided pearls of wisdom in dealing with this issue of shortages of all kinds of medical countermeasures, pharmaceuticals, medical products, there's two words that each and every one of you has had permeating your questions and your thoughts. And they're two simple words. And although you haven't always said them explicitly, they have been part of your thoughts and discussion about this important issue. And those words are, what if? Because if you think about it, the preparation and the planning for some kind of situation, we would ask a what if question if a hurricane struck your area or an earthquake struck your area. On the other hand, there's the flip side of the what if, and it was brought up in an earlier session about what if we had 3, 4, 5, 6, $700 million to spend on products. What would we do? What if has both positive and negative connotations, but we can use it for good rather than for evil if you want to think of it that way. So I think it's an important point for us to think about as we look at shortages and strategies to prevent them, because there's so much potential opportunity. We're fortunate to have a wonderful panel of people who represent industry, academia, and government. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through a discussion focused around some of these issues so they can share their pearls of wisdom and their thoughts with us to give us an idea of how we can move forward and hopefully bring even more discussion to the table. So first I want to thank all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel and pleasure to have you join us and share your thoughts. So let's start out with just a simple question. We've heard a lot about the current strategies for preventing shortages. Maybe you can give some of your thoughts on the strengths and the weaknesses of those strategies as we move into this prevention of shortages issue. Robin?
Yeah, I'll start. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. This will be the first time I've been able to talk without my U.S. government filters on. So not that those of you know me, that ever really was a problem for me. 2 words. Market failure. The 12 years I was at BARDA, we dealt with market failure. There weren't any products. But this is market failure. What that is compounded by is market failure in day-to-day medicine. Jim Grant's comments yesterday, for those of you that were here, were the clarion call of the canary in the coal mine. Because if we don't have the products available during non-crisis times, they're surely not going to be there when disasters occur. And you can fool yourself But you can't make those course adjustments during the event like that. They already have to be in place. You can make tactical, fine adjustments, and you can swap and trade, and you can do a lot of that. And I've done it. I've been there with you in the trenches doing it. But just know that when you have to go from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands of patients that have to be treated, and you've got a shortage already, it's not going to happen. There's not going to be some magic bullet or IT or social media that's going to come solve this. You have to do it ahead of time. And what he said yesterday is the most concerning thing I've heard in a number of years. And I've heard quite a few alarming things in my tenure. And when I was at Director of BARDA, we actually worked with the FDA and actually addressing with some pilot programs some drug shortages. But what is now happening, it's gotten worse. So to your point is that, are there some frameworks and structure? That the commissioner at FDA has put together a task force is one of the first steps, and I applaud that greatly.
Excellent.
In parallel, the president actually has to use his powers with PCAST. He has an advisory council that he can bring together and address this. This is actually going towards actually putting together a strategic plan similar to what was done for combating antimicrobial drug resistance. Because there, you're losing drugs that they're just not going to work. Here, you just don't even have the drugs. And again, it comes back to the original root cause: market failure. And the reason it's a market failure is because many of these drugs have such low margins of profit that many of the companies have relegated them to outsource them, and therefore you're going to have manufacturing issues, and therefore you're going to have quality issues. And we've seen this for a number of years, and it just is a not only a chronic problem, it is an acute chronic problem. And that when we do have disasters, whether they be a hurricane or other natural disasters, or when the next epidemic of known or unknown proportions occurs, we're not going to be able to have those products that are necessary for the everyday maintenance of our healthcare infrastructure. And so, again, that was a canary call. And so this may be a very visceral meeting that Jim Grant actually, told everyone, we can't do medicine as we should, and we have to do it. But so the next thing is that we have a campaign that's led by the federal government that goes out to industry, to state and local governments and institutions and NGOs to address this problem and have industry there and have a very frank discussion with them. We know what you're doing. We know why you're doing it, and believe me, you have a board and you have shareholders that you're accountable to, but at the same time, you do have a trust with, in this country, the American public, of keeping the American public healthy and secure. And if you can't do that, then we have. And I think there's going to be a discussion as to one of the solutions that the industry is actually doing, and academia is doing itself, which I'll be happy to hear more about.
Well, that's a good lead. And Rena, how about you? Would you like to share on that point?
Yes, absolutely. We didn't coordinate, but we are completely aligned. Let me introduce myself. I am a health economist. I recently transitioned from the University of Chicago to BU's business school. I'm an associate director of the Biopharmaceutical and Public Policy Research Institute at BU Business School. I'm also about to be publicly named a special advisor to the FDA in the Office of Generic Drugs. And there I will focus on supply issues, both in terms of the drugs that people use every single day, largely generic drugs, but also drugs that are vulnerable to shortage. There are overlap in those categories, but not complete overlap. For about 12 years now, I've worked on the supply and the pricing and demand for pharmaceutical products, and I've written many articles, but I also had the pleasure to serve on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Drug Pricing that released its report last year, where the committee was commissioned to address questions related to drug supply and adequacy of supply in addition to a larger mandate, and there is some recommendations on that report as well. So I completely agree that what we have here is a failure of collective action, and it's collective action across both a very complex supply chain, which includes pharma, but does not only include pharma, but also, as I think we heard today and also yesterday, healthcare infrastructure more generally, which includes hospitals and physicians and pharmacists as well. I agree as well that it is in the clear both health and security interests of American consumers to have an adequate supply of drugs when they need them, but also that the quality of those drugs be as high as possible as well. And the shortage issues that we are facing and have been facing are both an issue of a failure to supply that meets demand, but also a failure to supply adequate quality products to be consumed by people who are sick. Members of the supply chain, again, pharma, but others, do not have complete alignment of those interests with the American public. And that's because they all have their own incentives and their own objectives that they are acting on, largely to either maximize profit, their own product profit, or to minimize costs. Because of that, we don't have the drugs that we need in the adequate supply and or in adequate quality. If we want to alter the supply of these products, both in terms of, again, their adequacy of quantity, responding to potentially very lumpy demand in the case of disasters, but just more generally that we are experiencing now, but also that to have maintain standards of quality at the level that we need them, I believe that we have to change the incentives. Before we talk a little bit about those incentives and how they can be changed, I would argue, I'll agree with Robin as well, that really what we need is collective action on the part of both private companies, pharma, but other members of the supply chain, other members of our healthcare system, but also an unprecedented collective action, or at least coordination, between members of federal agencies or federal agencies that don't necessarily have well-worn paths for working together. So under HHS, we have BARDA, we have CDC, we have the FDA, we have CMS that all need some collective action. But across agencies, we have HHS that probably needs to be working with the FTC and also the State Department to really think through the adequacy of supply, but also what the quality of these suppliers are that are entering into the U.S. Maybe I'll stop there and then we can talk about.
Sure, that's excellent, excellent. Anita, what's the perspective coming from the CDC that you see?
Sure, so thank you. My name is Anita Patel. I'm with the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In terms of this conversation, just to give you a little background, I was the technical lead for the Strategic National Stockpile during the 2009 H1N1 response. I was the domestic PPE lead during the Ebola response, and most recently, I was the infectious disease and medical countermeasure lead during the Puerto Rico hurricane response. The lessons learned from all these responses, so I'm going to shift a little. I know there's a lot of shortage issues with just everyday products that we've discussed, focusing a little bit more on response and preparedness actions that we're taking from the federal government side. There's a lot of ongoing work, and a lot of it comes from the past responses that we've experienced and the lessons learned from these experiences. As Robin mentioned, we get into responses and we have to pivot at the time of the event to adjust what's needed for that response. I think the hospital tiered strategy that CDC led and along with ASPR is a great example of this from Ebola. We created a strategy that was for hospital preparedness and focused on it. But then in addition to that, we did right-size the amount of PPE that was needed in order to have facilities ready to go and be able to receive patients. So having the ability to pivot at the time of a response, shift the products that we're using, it really needs to be this overall systems approach. So from a preparedness standpoint, we've actually broken this down, and this is going to be published actually next week, but it's really looking at antivirals, but it can be extrapolated for any medical countermeasure. So when we're thinking about the system, yes, supply is a huge component of it, but it really starts on the front end of, do we have the right products? And we have massive initiatives like BARDA, for example, within the USG that can actually help improve this space of having better products available. Then do we have the right clinical guidance for these products? We've mentioned ASHP being a great partner to be able to provide alternatives for products. CDC is the lead in providing clinical guidance for these products and how they're used, whether it's infection control or whether it's actual infectious disease responses. Not only should we have the products that are needed, but can we also put alternatives into the guidance strategies that are out there, knowing that once we put guidance out, especially during a response, what's going to happen? The supply chain is going to wipe out. We had very few cases of Ebola that patients actually being treated in the US, but we had a wipeout of the system. Why? CDC put guidance out within 2 weeks, we had an impact on the supply chain. So understanding what the guidance is, and if the guidance gets put out there, how it's implemented and the impact on that, ensuring that manufacturers know, heads up, we're going to put products in here that healthcare normally doesn't use and the chemical industry uses, and it's going to cause an impact. You're not necessarily going to know how to get these products, and understanding these like operational components of putting guidance out there is important. And then when we move to the actual supply issues, the major lesson learned coming out of Ebola for me as the domestic PPE lead was this whole concept of, we've got this need for product, we have massive orders, a tangled supply chain. When you look at PPE, it's not linear, it's not like pharma as we discussed a little while ago. How do we ensure that manufacturers are willing to ramp up? Going back to your point of incentives, what's the incentive? Is there a way for the government to take the risk off the table for manufacturers? At the end of the day, if we're planning on stockpiling these products and having them procured, can we make these guaranteed purchases on the front end, ramp up manufacturing so that we have a better supply situation, especially in these supply chains where you don't have a linear line of sight? So when you move past supply, it's the distribution piece. Having X amount of product, it needs to get to where it needs to go. So what's the distribution components to getting that product out there? Do we need to actually physically move product, or can we redirect the supply chain, which is one of the strategies we used during the Ebola response? And then ensuring that people have access to the product. Where is it coming from? Is it Amazon? Is it the pharmacy down the street? Is it the Strategic National Stockpile? So understanding those access points and directing people to know where to go to get these products is going to be important. And that brings us into tools that are available too. Are there calculators? Are there things that we can augment preparedness in? We created a PPE calculator tool that really looked at the CDC guidance and helped to determine the amount of product that hospitals need to have. Those types of preparedness measures on the front end, we've done it for Ebola. We're extrapolating that tool to meet the needs of other threats as well now. And then the last piece of this is really that public provider acceptance component of this. So if you've got all of this happening, are providers okay with what we're saying? If we're asking healthcare industry, to me, is the most delicate in the sense of we're so critically dependent on our healthcare workers coming into a facility to take care of patients. If we're in a situation where we've got an emerging infectious disease and we don't have a medical countermeasure, we can't vaccinate and protect these individuals, personal protective equipment is the only thing that we're going to have available for them. So how do we right-size the products that are needed based on a patient's occupational risk? Or how can we take some cool materials, looking at RPDs, for example, respiratory protective devices, can we take an 800 count bed sheet, fold it 4 times, and can that provide some level of protection? So those are some of the things that we're looking at on the CDC front, but it's really an interagency effort. So most recently, what we've been working on, I co-chair the respiratory protective device work group with the interagency. So this includes CDC, FDA, NIH, DOD is involved, VA is involved, OSHA is involved. It's an interagency effort to come up with a national strategy to tackle specifically this respiratory protective device issue, because we've seen it come up time and time again. So is there a way for us to take this end-to-end approach? And this is where you're talking about collective action, understanding that anything we do in this national strategy has to do two key factors. And I think this is something that is applicable across all countermeasures that we're talking about, all medical supplies and drugs, is do what we can do to increase supply, but do what we can do to decrease demand. So those two factors together will help influence this space and actually improve that delta from a supply and demand standpoint. So having better products, strategies to improve the use of what we have, and how do we use what we have better. Better guidance is needed from a clinical standpoint, but also from an overall standpoint. Standards, so again, this PPE industry is completely complex. CDC thought thought it was great for us to be able to identify that you need a level 3 or a level 4 gown. What does that mean? The person placing these orders within a hospital, these products are not labeled this way. So some of this is just implementation where the rubber meets the road, that we can say that technically you need to do X, Y, and Z. But if you don't have the operational capacity to take that guidance and implement it, that's where you're going to start seeing failures occur. So keeping it simple but technically accurate, and having the tools and the systems and the ability to be able to implement the guidance. CDC had teams on the ground. So the guidance was put out there. We were testing the guidance, we were helping the hospitals implement it, and then changing it to meet the needs. We were looking at inventory levels across these hospitals, understanding what they had, understanding where their gaps were, and adjusting what we're saying they needed. So that on the ground, boots on the ground approach in preparedness is going to be critical. So the last piece is the supply chain improvement. So we've talked about having manufacturing capacity built up, having raw materials, having US capacity secured. There's also this concept of bubbles of inventory, and Rob and I were actually talking about this during lunch. Part of the RPD national strategy proposal is for us to not have centralized stockpiles for a product that is used in high volume every day. How do we increase elasticity in the overall supply chain? I think Linda spoke about this as well in her remarks. Facilities, distributors, manufacturers, the federal government, having bubbles of inventory put throughout the supply chain increases that overall elasticity. And then, as we mentioned, sharing the risk, I think, is going to be critical. And it was also mentioned earlier, increasing visibility of what's happening, what the orders are, what the true need for product is. FDA actually had a system some years ago that was under development that was trying to look at the need and actual use rate for products within a hospital. It's really hard. So what systems can we use, what can we draw from to help inform the actual need for product versus what we're doing for preparedness and stockpiling at that facility level to help inform what's needed from a manufacturing standpoint. So, sorry, I said a lot, so I'll stop there.
You said a lot in more ways than one. Edwin, you're the CEO of the Supply Chain Wizard, so we're expecting magic from you here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this?
Sometimes in conferences or in meetings, they ask me, is Supply Chain Wizard is your company or is your title? I say both. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here among the distinguished speakers here. So I think what I can bring from an insight perspective is much higher level industry landscape, what's going on right now. So before that, I'll introduce myself, a little bit of my background. So because of the name Supply Chain Wizard, I actually have my entire career in supply chain. I had my PhD at Georgia Tech, Industrial and Systems Engineering, focusing on supply chain and demand management. I moved over to McKinsey & Company as a consultant focused in supply chain. I worked in 6 or 7 different industries, including medical devices. And then I moved over to pharma industry with Sandoz, Novartis, in the generic supply chain management. And that's the first time I was getting into an industry that I believed at the time, oh my God, this industry is far, far behind all the other industries I've been to. Like, when I say far behind, I'm not talking about a couple of years. I'm talking about a couple of decades. So we still have paper everywhere in this industry right now, right this second. If you move on to a site, they will give you this thick batch records all in paper. And they carry this around. They have carts used to carry this around. So After Sandoz, I started Supply Chain Wizard, and I had the privilege to work with over 40 different manufacturers, mostly generic manufacturers. And our focus area was implementing regulations and compliance called track and trace systems, serialization systems. And this is a major industry change and shift right now to help prevent counterfeiting. So what I want to do is to tie these two major industry dynamics that's happening at the same time. So the last 2 days we talked a lot about the shortages, which is clear. There's a lot of shortages going on. But then there's another big dynamic going on called counterfeiting. So that probably will take many different conferences, this one, in of itself. But the counterfeiting is a market right now, according to the World Health Organization. 10% of the world drug supply is counterfeit. Up to 20-30% in developing countries, for example, some countries in Africa, 20-30% of the drugs that you go to a pharmacy, you try to buy, it's counterfeiting. And that number of the value of this counterfeiting drug is about $75 to $200 billion a year. So why am I telling you about the counterfeiting issue? Because governments right now, including the US government, stepped in for a regulatory interference and said, we want traceability of the supply chain. We want track and trace, we want serialization. Every single unit of product could be traceable. And now we are in the middle of big investments. Everybody has to do this. In the US, that's called Drug Supply Chain Security Act. It's a 10-year regulation. And the deadline for the manufacturers to implement the serialization is this November. If you ask me if we are ready, 100%, we are not. European Union have a very similar regulation that is due for manufacturers and all the parties to February 2019. And yesterday I was discussing the readiness level of the European manufacturers, and with exact numbers, there are 2,400 manufacturers in Europe supplying the European market. That was a regulation of 3 years. We are like 2.5 years plus into it. And they have a European hub, an IT system, a database that everybody should be connected to exchange data and the serial numbers. And as of today, less than 1,000 or so of these companies have applied, I'm saying applied, paperwork-wise, to be part of this database. They all have to be connected by February, by the way. And of the 1,000 or so companies, technically only 106 of them connected today. So that's less than 5% readiness. So again, why am I saying all this? There's a big disruption coming to the pharmaceutical industry, and especially the manufacturing landscape. Everybody's investing millions, sometimes billions of dollars to comply with the counterfeiting measures and track and trace. And this is a cost prohibitive. And for many small manufacturers, some of it is leading to an industry dynamic that they're no longer affording to be compliant. So in the next few years, we'll be seeing a lot of exits from the market, manufacturing consolidations. That was already happening a lot. I wake up today with the news that Sandoz US, which was my former company, some of the assets has been acquired by another company. So, and a few months ago, same company who bought Sandoz US, Aurobindo, has been buying other assets in Europe. And Aurobindo is an Indian-based company. So these consolidations and mergers and acquisitions are accelerating. And if we don't have drug supply, when we have less suppliers, do you think that our supply options will be more or less? So these counterfeiting measures, although it's all in the good intentions, are actually impacting more negatively the drug supply and drug shortages. So, and when we come back to the drug supply, drug shortages, which needs to be analyzed in multiple levels. So, unlike Anita, I can actually consider Anita as a response expert now, based on what you're saying. I have zero experience responding to disasters, but I have a lot of experience getting caught in the middle of disasters. So I have that lucky thing going on. So for example, exactly 1 year ago today, I was in the middle of Caribbean in a Disney cruise. That was our first Disney cruise experience, or first cruise experience. And the captain announced that because of Hurricane Irma, we're going back to Florida. That was only 3 days in, we're going back. And at that moment, I said, okay, well, how do we respond to the disaster? I'm stuck in the middle of the ocean and the ship. So first shortages was there's no flights. I immediately go online, try to look for the flights back home. No flights left. The second, shortages was the cars. I tried to find cars so that I can at least drive myself and my family back to, north. And luckily, there were some cars available, but I booked both car agencies, Hertz and Avis, just in case. So I have a lot of the psychology of the victim in the middle of a disaster, so I can understand when you don't have something for your family, you have all the basic instincts kicking in to do something. The third shortage was the gas. So we booked the biggest car we can book, so that it lasts as long as possible, driving towards Atlanta, which is normally a 6-hour drive. And I saw a lot of families, a lot of cars pulled over, no gas, nothing. So you know what saved us? There's a little app called Gas Buddy that one of my friends recommended that tells me exactly where the gas supply is. Like of all the gas stations we passed by, no supply, no supply. We went straight to the target and we got the gas. And that helped us refuel. And we made ourselves back to Georgia, and then it took us 18 hours, normally 6 hours. I was totally exhausted. I finally saved myself. So I'm not going to take any more cruise vacations anytime soon. And then 2 years ago, about the same time, I got caught. Like I landed to Turkey. I'm originally from Turkey, and I got like an hour into my landing, there was a military coup going on. So like either I'm attracting these disasters, or I'm really good at chasing them. And then the first response in my head was, okay, what do I do with this situation? Because the last military coup was like when I wasn't even born. And okay, I landed, I have no cash. Let's go to the ATM machine. My American cards are not working. Luckily, I had a Turkish card, and I got whatever the maximum limit was. And then the next town we were driving by, very long queues of people trying to get cash out, because you never know if there will be cash. You have access to your cash in the bank, but you cannot get the paper. And then long queues in front of the market like water. So I have a great experience understanding the psychology of these things, but responding to it obviously takes a lot of expertise. So if we take this drug shortage to multiple levels, the global level, I think it can only be addressed at a strategic industry level. So if there's a product that is missing in the whole world, that's a totally different problem to address. If there's a shortage at the national level, and there are cases right now that US is enjoying the abundance of supply, whereas a country like Turkey, for example, is not getting that same product. Why? Because the prices are set by the government at such a low level that an international manufacturing company would not want to sell their drug, which is on limited supply, to a country like Turkey. They would rather sell it in the United States, where there are higher prices, free market pricing, etc. So that's a national level problem that we also need to be aware of and solve at the national level problem solving sessions. The local level problem, where the disaster hits, there is supply, but we cannot get the supply to the local area. So that's more operational, tactical level, and that's where I think we can think a lot about day-to-day, how do we manage the supply chain. Being prepared is one thing, but one of the things that I heard from multiple people is, it goes, all the preparedness can sometimes go out the window. Like you train people and then they do a totally different thing. You tell them you need to order one, they order 100 just in case. Right? I need to book one car because I need one car for my family. I booked both of them. Nobody can blame me for it.
So you stockpiled?
Well, at least booking-wise, yes, I overbooked.
That's right.
So, yeah, so I think coming down to the local level, I really wonder, what other participants are thinking. How can we solve at that local level, with a supply chain, perspective, but then much higher level, that's a big, policy and regulatory topic to discuss.
You've raised two aspects here. One on human behavior, which we've touched on, and how that factors into response planning and also response actions. But then the other piece here is this overall idea of staying flexible during a response and being able to be prepared to be flexible. And so there's been some great examples in the past with H1N1 when we needed N95 respirators and we started seeing shortages appear. We immediately started shifting trying to impact the demand component, introducing concepts of like reuse of N95s, right? For Ebola, creating the tiered strategy to right-size the amount of product that each type of hospital would need, given that we were taking a tiered approach to healthcare. And then looking at the hurricane response, this one was very unique, where we were looking to improve the situation for vaccine-preventable diseases and ensure that there was vaccines available. The National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases had teams on the ground working with immunization programs. One of the thoughts that came in to get some of our vaccine for children's providers back up and running was, should we consider, the problem isn't the lack of product. The problem is a systems problem where you didn't have the capacity to be able to maintain the cold chain for this product. So the solution could be generators. The solution could be hopefully give additional refrigerators if they were needed, because some of those were damaged. But could the solution have been solar paneling? What does Puerto Rico have? They have sun, right? So maybe we were thinking about the problem differently. And we were thinking about the problem in a more traditional way in a response. This is where it really helps to have some untraditional solutions. You ideally don't want to have a new thought dropped in a response, but you have to be able to pivot. And I know Robin and others can attest to this, that in the midst of a response, you do what's needed to make things happen using what you have available and at whatever capacity possible, usual systems. Because the last thing you want to do is drop down a new system, but it doesn't mean you can't drop down a new idea. So, and they ended up, we didn't do it for the vaccine situation, but solar paneling was something that one of our private sector partners did put forth and actually had the Children's Hospital paneled out with solar panels to ensure that they had operational capacity in sustaining it.
I agree. I think that these measures make a lot of sense when you're in the midst of responding. But the real one question is really about, to what extent, what can we do to really prevent these types of things before they occur? And I've largely spent time thinking about that. I would say, first, it's clear we need more transparency in the system about exactly who is supplying these products, and not just supplying them, not just able to supply them, but actually supplying them. They are two different things. The vast majority of drugs that we know of that are vulnerable to supply have one or two manufacturers that are actually making them. That is 60% of all generic products available in the market. They have very tight supply. The count of actual suppliers is actually quite tight here. Not only is that just the count, so that's the count of manufacturers who are supplying, who have a labeled product, who are labeling that product and selling it into the market. But we suspect that many of these products have even tighter supply than the count of actual labelers making these drugs are. And that's because of the increased and actually exponential reliance on contract manufacturing in these markets. So if you have two labelers who are selling a product, but both of those labelers are using the same contract manufacturer to make that product, you don't have two suppliers, you have one. And right now, although we may be able to count potential manufacturers that can hold the license to make these products, it's actually very difficult to count the number of manufacturers actually making these products, and even more difficult, if not fundamentally impossible, to identify the use of contract manufacturing in the publicly available or even privately available data systems that we have. That has to change.
So I can comment on the CMO market because we have been busy last 5 years helping manufacturers, especially the large generic manufacturers. There is a lot of use of contract manufacturing organizations, and it's surprisingly high numbers in the order of hundreds of manufacturers, contract manufacturers are being used. In some cases, manufacturing is a different side, and then packaging is a different side. So the complexity of supply chain is like I haven't seen anywhere else. And this adds to the lead time of the supply. In some cases, some of the very complex to make, hard to make drugs like oncology drugs could take a 6 months lead time. From the order, let's say in the US market, to the supplier in Europe, it takes 6 months to arrive. And then may take another month or so for quality release. And let's say your forecasting is only as good as like 3 months or 6 months out. You don't even know what's going to be sold in a year from now. So you're just like shooting in the dark, placing an order. The order comes, batch is released, and God forbid that batch has a problem, so it's recalled or it's rejected. Then you're like a whole year gap of supply.
Exactly, and I mean, right, so these comments have largely been around fill and finish products, but understanding exactly who is supplying the base ingredients for these products is even less known and more opaque. And there are contracts attached to the sources of those base ingredients that have may exclude others who may want to enter into this product, or even may have quantity commitments that effectively exclude potential others from entering into these markets. So it's both transparency on who is actually making these fill and finish products, but it's also transparency into who is actually making and supplying the base ingredients that are key here.
Brenna, I think I have some good news for you, because the transparency is going to be put in place with the track and trace regulations. So we have been doing that groundwork as the industry for the last 4 or 5 years in the US. So now every manufacturer needs to connect with all of their finished goods contract manufacturers and contract packagers in an electronic platform in order to comply with the US Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So we have now complete transparency of every manufacturing step, starting from the packaging, all the SKUs, products, product families, NDC numbers, GTIN numbers. We will have complete transparency. However, regulations right now, anywhere in the world, including US, does not cover the API and the raw materials. So that, I think, is still dark, but we have made a great progress as industry in clarifying how the supply works in the finished goods onward. But upstream supply chain could possibly be in the scope in the upcoming years or decades.
So the other piece of this that is really important is really thinking about how can we alter the incentives that would act to increase demand for favored suppliers, those that consistently demonstrate a commitment to quality, to transparency, and also to assured supply. In other words, even potentially redundant supply or contracting to make sure that, again, to prevent the possibility of shortages when they occur, or to prevent, or in the case of a disaster. Conversely, I believe that this also requires penalties and increased penalties. So on those suppliers, both at the level of either fill and finish products or on the API manufacturers, but also potentially on the distribution chain more generally, who cheat, either on quantity and or on what they say about what their capacity is relative to what they're actually doing. And some combination of, this can potentially be dealt with some combination of changes in contracting, maybe changes in quality metrics that would be both at the manufacturer level, but also parts of the other parts of the supply chain, but may also, and this we need to kind of get real on, may also require changes in price. In other words, we may have to be willing to pay higher prices than we do now for certain products to make sure that the signal that we really mean it. We actually want redundant supply, and we actually want full commitment to transparency and to quality manufacture, gets all the way down to the folks who are making these trade-offs at the dollar and cents level.
Robin?
Just throw another recommendation, and that is something that we did in the federal government that worked really well, and Anita is at the CDC, and Greg Burrell, who's here, and my colleagues at BARDA, was that we stockpiled, not just a little bit, we stockpiled tens of billions, hundreds of millions of things, and we realized that we couldn't stockpile our way out of everything. Part of it is that with commercial products, there's a thing called vendor managed inventory where you actually rotate the product. And so what industry, and I'm being on both sides of this now, actually want is they want a guarantee, or they want assurance, and this is what their investors and their shareholders want. They want assurance that if you say you're going to buy 100 pair of socks this year and next year, that you really do that. And that if you need 150 pair of socks, that they will do that, and they'll make sure that you get your specific amount, that 100 you want, but because they have an assurance that it will happen. And part of that is not just by the federal government, and the federal government should be a collective of the Department of Defense, the Veterans Administration, and the many different parts of HHS that are consumers, to collectively utilize their buying power to actually use vendor managed inventory for that, which then that actually builds up the capacity, that builds up the ability for companies to have a little bit more, with the assurance that they will actually deliver when it's there. But also it can be taken to the state level, it can actually be taken to the local level, and it can be taken outside of government, of where you have collectives. And I think there's a proposal here we may hear about in which there actually has been taken on to do something like this. But with vendor managed inventory, you don't have to have it there. That eliminates the problem with the scenario we had yesterday, so that everything is not in one site. And actually, most good manufacturing practicing companies have various sites in which they actually have their API, or they actually have their final product in different sites because of that. They don't want to lose this because that's just gone. That money's gone.
So one of the things that we do with vaccines is we practice both. We pay for quality, right? We pay higher prices than we necessarily have to, in terms of we pay higher than marginal cost. But we also make quantity commitments. And we say to vendors, we say to suppliers, we want your product. This is how much we will guarantee purchasing of your product. And that, I think, reassures manufacturers and other members of the supply chain that this isn't some sort of chicken and egg. This isn't some sort of game where, gee, we really, really, really want your product, but when you actually produce that product, we really, really want that product at the lowest cost possible. Manufacturers see that game, they don't want to play that game.
Yeah, so this goes back to taking the risk off the table. So there's different ways to do it, whether it's ordering early on in a response, or whether it's having better ordering practices so that there's predictable volumes being ordered by the USG on a regular basis for entities, whether it be strategic national stockpile or larger facility, DoD, VA, et cetera, everyone buying product together. And then looking at concepts like having a centralized contract to be able to guarantee volume-based pricing across all the entities that need it. But that risk piece, that's one thing we've seen time and time again, every single response, but even in the preparedness mode when we're trying to understand where the gaps are in supply, that manufacturers will not want to, there's only so much business risk they can take. They want to help. These are not manufacturers of, like, maple syrup, I don't know, like random product. This is healthcare, right? These are drugs, devices, anything used to diagnose, prevent, and treat. These are important products. And the manufacturers, there is absolutely, I'm not going to argue the business principles here, business is what's driving everything, but there's a fundamental want to help. There is a need for they want to be part of the solution, and they're willing to be, and they're there. Every time we've called them, they've been there. But will that continue without the commitments that are needed and the collective action that's needed? And we talked a lot about the government and what we can do and what's happening right now across, whether it's ASPR, CDC, FDA, like all of our partnerships. It's also our partnerships and our commitments with private sector, our Rolodexes. We've got a lot of folks in the federal government that have left, and they really want Robin's Rolodex. So how do we sustain these partnerships in a more systematic way that's committed, so that they're not so much built on Rolodexes, understanding that, of course, a handshake's going to go a long way in this space, too. So having that in place and the partnerships in place, whether it's with HIDA, and I know Linda spoke a lot about the partnership she's already been engaged with, but who else? Who else needs to be at the table? How do we ensure that we're taking a total systems approach in this, not just looking at supply, but all the other pieces that impact increasing supply and decreasing demand over time?
So this really comes back to my original comment, and this is why I think this is acute enough that it requires the White House to actually intervene on this. And this says we have to have a campaign against drug shortage. And again, I think the task force is the right first step. But we have to carry this all the way up to actually get it all the way up to the Hill so that they actually have a legislative bill and appropriations to pass. And it's not 700 or 800 million. I'm sorry. We're talking billions of dollars that have to be in it. And there have to be incentives that make manufacturers that have these low margin products to say, we have a altruistic here, and we have also opportunities that we have to balance. That it make it worthwhile for them not only to provide globally, but also in the U.S. And there are some levers that we don't use in the federal government that we have. One is that we actually have in every single government contract, Best Buy in America. Mike Bowen knows this really well, okay? I got to tell you, we don't do it very well in the government to do that. It's best price. No, it's best value. Best value. And guess what? I saw this over the last 12 years. Best value in medicine is a national security issue. Okay? So if we fail on this, we become vulnerable. And, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars for national security. We can afford to spend tens of billions in this area. Secondly, is that we are at a disadvantage for big purchase items. And I was involved in this in H1N1, in which we can't go have a contract and go out and buy, $100 billion or several billion dollars worth of stuff because we don't have the appropriations or because Congress hasn't passed a bill yet. It's called the Anti-Deficiency Act. I would suggest that we have a waiver for disasters for that. Because Congress will come back, and they always do, and they appropriate the funding to do this. So from the everyday to the really catastrophic during the event, I think that is a measure of all that. And lastly is the really frank discussion I spoke of earlier, and that is manufacturers, you do understand that there's a little known act that was from the Korean War that we do have at the U.S. the federal government level. It's called the Defense Production Act. In the 12 years I was with the federal government and being responsible and accountable for this, we used it one time. It was during H1N1, and it was with masks and respirators. But I will tell you this, what it does is it actually makes you rate your orders. And guess what? We can actually rate orders for everyday medicines, if necessary, to make sure that they get out and that the first ones that come out go to where we say it is. Now, that's a draconian method, but it can be used if necessary. And that's a lever that under emergency preparedness and emergency disasters, you may have to think about actually pulling out and doing that. And I guarantee you manufacturers sit up, and I've been, again, on both sides of this, sit up and say, we'll do whatever you want us to do. Really.
Our time is running short, unfortunately. There's so much to say. We can probably go on for another hour, but I do want to give people in the audience the opportunity to ask some questions if they do. There's been a common theme that has pervaded the discussion. We're talking about risk reduction, we're talking about a systems approach, and the challenge when you have a complex system, which is highly nonlinear, versus a complicated system, which is much more easy to manage because it's more linear and predictable, is that risk reduction is overwhelmingly more difficult, infinitely more difficult. It's an intractable problem. So given that fact, we do have a question over here. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself by name and affiliation, please.
Hi, Erin Fox, University of Utah Health. I don't know if it's There we go. Erin Fox, University of Utah Health. Thank you so much to the panelists. I agree with everything that has been said. Well done. I did just want to clarify one thing about DSCSA. To my knowledge, it will not require disclosure of the contract manufacturers. So we will still have that huge gap in where our drugs are coming from.
Let me address that. So you may not be able to do that, but I guarantee you that any good purchasing agent or contracting officer can actually say, I want in the contract for you to disclose who your CMO is, and not just the CMO that you have listed, 5 of them here, the one that you actually are using for this period of time, and the other members of your supply chain going forward. Because you can do it contractually. Why? Because you've got money on the table and they want and they want your business, and they'll disclose it.
Yeah, that's a great strategy. We'll keep trying. Apparently, University of Utah doesn't have enough money, but we'll keep
It's a common problem.
One clarification on the DSCSA, it doesn't also say or mandate many things. Like it's a law, it's written at the high level. The technical details of how this law is put in practice is where the interesting details and the facts are. So what my comment was in terms of clarification and visibility is that manufacturers themselves, they didn't have a good enough clarity and transparency where their products are coming from. It's all handled local level contracting, regional level, national, global level. So all of this is now being streamlined and clarified, at least within the business. And between the business partners, obviously it's up to them on how they do the business. Who else would like to access that information? That's definitely outside of the scope of the SCSA, but if the information is there, if the data is there, and if there's a good use for it, I'm sure the right parties come together and talk about how to use that.
We have a question over here.
Sure, just a few comments from the drug manufacturer. I'm Brenda Shaffey from GlaxoSmithKline. So I think there are a lot of things the drug manufacturer can do to help with this issue. Certain things such as developing really robust supply chain mapping, as has been discussed, and identifying the risk in that supply chain and actually taking steps to register redundant supplies at the higher risk areas. Actually, if there were incentives for manufacturers to do that, I, for one, could say GSK certainly tries to do it in the absence of incentives. But certain incentives, such as perhaps priority review vouchers, or maybe that's too much to ask. I don't know if Dr. Throckmorton's here, but perhaps even expedited review vouchers for prior approval supplements that don't relate to a shortage of supply that we need to change quickly, but it's not related to maintaining drug supply continuity. That might be something that could be offered to get industry to say, hey, look, we'll map out our supply chain, we'll identify our risk, we'll take steps to register a second supply. On the back end, perhaps we can have a voucher that we could lay in with a prior approval supplement, which would be an incentive, something that we would like to have a faster review post-approval. Perhaps slight extension of patent exclusivity if we're talking about a new molecule. Things like that relate to the review process and exclusivity that don't necessarily take upfront budget money that folks might want to consider. Other things the industry can do might be to register with the drug shortage team. What is your company's process for monitoring and identifying gaps in supply continuity? So for example, at GSK, what we do is we have weekly supply chain escalation review meetings. So anytime there's any market in the world of any drug, especially medically necessary, our senior leadership has a look at those flags that come up from the manufacturing sites. Hey, we've had an issue, equipment went down, or we have a quality concern, we have to hold until we do our investigation. Those get escalated up very quickly, especially for the medically necessary drug products. Weekly for the U.S. market, what I do is I look at inventories that come through that sit in the U.S. distribution center for GSK, and of the supply chain managers, they essentially identify which products are either out of stock, projected to go out of stock, or low stock. And so for that listing each week, we understand whether or not are we going to be able to resupply before the distribution channel would run out. So we need to have enough buffer in that supply chain. And the way we do that is we set safety stock levels. So another thing the industry could do, perhaps, this would require upfront money, perhaps get the company to double their safety stock levels. So the strategic national stockpile doesn't have to hold the inventory for the nation, but the actual drug manufacturers' distribution centers within the U.S. could do that. So I would presume other manufacturers do as well, but GSK will manufacture to a safety stock level. And it's based on supply and demand, and it gives a buffer, so if there's a peak in orders, there's enough buffer there so that we can make up more and not have an impact on what we're able to fill wholesaler orders for. So we could up those levels, and then that provides additional inventory there in the event of a need. It might mitigate, if other companies, if we did it as an industry, it might prevent other like the emergency room shortages that we were hearing about yesterday.
This is actually a great example. So you're talking about it at the manufacturer level. We've actually taken action and take action on it on a seasonal level for flu. Mm-hmm. So seasonal flu is really unique in the sense that we do all this pan-flu planning, but seasonal flu allows us to have this platform and this foundation to be able to test ideas, and in some instances, we end up experiencing seasons that are worse than some pandemics. So we look at the last flu season that we had. we were pretty much in response mode on the CDC side. So one of the things we've done, and the safety stock concept is brilliant, because if you're doing it at the manufacturer level, one of the things we started doing is the messaging down to pharmacies to increase par levels of inventory of oseltamivir and zanamivir. Like, those are the two drugs that are needed for treatment. If we're, from a CDC standpoint, going to be pushing the guidance and really encouraging people for early treatment as a recommendation, ensuring that if we're saying you need early treatment, that when they go to the pharmacies to get the product, that it's there on the shelf. The only way to do that is to increase that par level of inventory at the front end of the season, and to ensure that that's there. It's a seasonal product, unpredictable demand, but if you can do that and increase that par level. Now, what if we did that across the board for all of the products? Or what if we took the exercise scenario from yesterday and said everybody keep 96 hours or 2 weeks of inventory on hand, and it would really be able to change the space.
Yeah, no, I agree. I completely agree, and I think engagement with the industry is actually critical here. It's both, and it's critical again across agencies. I think we do, industries do, people do, and industries do what we measure, right? And so, if we actually ask the industry to tell us what they're doing, and what they may even want to do more of, I think that we would actually get lots of responses that are very proactive. I also think that there is this missing market out there for suppliers, in that we have existing suppliers manufacturing drugs and other medical products for the US market, but we could also lower barriers to entry among suppliers who are already making products in the US and who want to get into other products that right now the costs are just simply prohibitive. Or there may be other suppliers among trusted allies of ours, most notably in the European Union, that have very high standards for quality and for adequacy of supply, who may also want to enter. Even if you just simply lower the barrier to entry or simply signal we're open to that type of competition, competition alone will pull potentially some additional engagement by the industry that's already in the market, but also potentially kind of expand the pipeline.
I do want to have a quick
This will have to be the last comment.
Very short comment related to specifically the safety stock level. And thank you for bringing it up, because from a manufacturer perspective, this sounds and looks like the easiest things to fix. You just set a different higher level, you produce to that, every problem is solved. Unfortunately, as a person who worked on the safety stock analysis, worked with multiple manufacturers, this is one very difficult thing to implement in practice, because in terms of the overall dollar value that you're holding in stock is directly reported in the markets, and there are three major supply chain output metrics that are top of mind of the executives: the service levels, the cost, net working capital, or the inventory. And the overall tendency is to reduce the inventory. The only thing that could be done in the short term could be optimizing within the portfolio for those seasonal and highly fluctuating products, increase the safety stock on those, and then reduce the rest so that the overall safety stock does not really increase. So this is an uphill battle, and I fought it many years.
But I'm going to challenge you on this, because there are some companies that have actually been able to do this. I'll just call one of them out. Amgen did this. And I got to tell you, they were very reticent to work with us for years and years because of these issues. But then when we actually stockpiled it, we said, we don't want it to be in the SNS. We actually want it to be vendor managed, and you rotate the stock. And their accountants and their legal counsel were able to do this without any problem. And now it's been going on 9 years. And they've had 2 contracts renewed. So much so that their competitor at Sanofi Pasteur is doing the same thing. So it can be done.
And then the coupled solution with that is increased shelf life. So if you can increase shelf life and allow manufacturers to hold product for longer periods of time, and you've got more time to play with that inventory and for that inventory to be rotated out, especially in markets where you've got low volume of product usage.
With those enabling contracts and shelf life, you can actually do
exactly.
But good point.
We're going to have to we're going to have to end this temporarily. Of course, we have snacks and coffee to continue the discussion. Please help me in thanking our panelists for a very interesting and informative discussion. And how long of a break do you want to take? 2
minutes.
Okay.
You can stand and stretch for a minute if you'd like, but our next panel, panel 9, Dr. Remley and her team will be up. Dr. Kadlik is due here around 3 or 3:15-ish, and so we want to pretty much have the panel wrapped by the time he gets here. So stretch a minute, and Karen, you can gather your team, and I'll bring it together here in a few minutes.
Try to